Kevin Delaney, CEO and founder of Charter, before that Quartz, before that Wall Street Journal, and you were saying you've been covering Davos for more than 20 years. I'm on year 7 and I'm like, save yourself, but how has it changed for you in that time?
I mean, so much sleepier. I first came in 2000, and there's a whole, as you know, a whole corporate event that takes place kind of alongside the main official programming. All these companies, largely tech companies, finance companies, some governments actually have these big kiosks, offices, showcases along the promenade, the main route that goes alongside the Congress Center. None of that really existed 20 years ago, and when the focus was really on the Congress Center and the programming, and probably was a bit more substantive in a way and a bit less partying. Back in the day, the Russian delegation, who's been banned from the attending Davos at this point, was notorious for throwing wild parties around the swimming pool at the Congress Center. And so it was a much smaller, quieter. I was here one year when there were some globalization protests, and the protesters actually managed to come in along the promenade, along the main road, and got in a full-pitched battle with the police. They were lighting fires and overturning cars and throwing lumber at the police, who actually at that point didn't seem very prepared for that sort of thing. The level of security is significantly different today.
I was going to say, I mean, this is a pretty tight environment, certainly, at least in this perimeter of the Congress Center. And, you know, you talk about the Russian delegation that obviously hasn't been here since the invasion of Ukraine, but Russia House, what used to be Russia House, is now AI House, by the way, which tells you a little bit about how the agenda has changed, and we're going to talk about that. You've been having conversations with a number of private sector leaders. Sort of briefly, what are you hearing from them?
So I would say there are two big themes I would highlight. The first one is just the economy. And I think for the U.S. economy in particular, there is a quiet consensus that 2024 is actually going to be a pretty good year. The economic conditions are pretty good. We have maybe a soft landing in the economy. Interest rate outlook is generally for lower interest rates, and inflation is moderated from where it was. Job market is pretty tight. And so it's quiet though, because companies actually are not publicly particularly optimistic or particularly positive about the outlook. Part of that is it's hard to do that in the context of the global conflicts that are going on. Obviously Israel, Ukraine, elsewhere, I think there is that level of risk. They're unwilling to stick their necks out around it. So that's the first thing. So quietly, the economic outlook is pretty positive, but people aren't sort of publicly saying too much about that. And then the second thing is AI, and just about every company, every CEO here has some sort of generative AI strategy. That's a difference from a year ago, where people had started using ChatGPT and it was talked about as something on the horizon. The CEOs have had a year to have their teams come up with strategies, research decks, and so their talking points are much maturer when it comes to talking about generative AI and the implications for business.
Yeah, it seems to me like there's a lot of exuberance about the sort of macro picture of what AI can bring to the global economy in this decade. But then on the flip side, there's deep concern about jobs. I want to ask you a little bit about that because I know so much of your work now is focused on jobs in the workplace. But also, one of the biggest criticisms about Davos and the so-called Davos man that Peter Goodman wrote about is that billionaires got richer, and this notion of stakeholder capitalism, a rising tide lifting everybody's boat, didn't really come to fruition. Do you see that potential in AI? And what kinds of policies would sort of keep us from that growing inequality?
I think there is that potential in AI, and this is an area that at Charter we've been doing a lot of work on, including research and talking to a lot of businesses about how they're doing. I think the research forecasts that there will be significant economic and business gains from implementing AI are real. There's a real consensus that we'll actually see global GDP increase greater than we'd expect thanks to the use of generative AI, and we're already seeing some of the early stages of that. So that actually seems quite credible. The question, which is kind of what you're getting at, I think, is that are those economic gains distributed more broadly, or is it the billionaire class that comes to Davos to say high-minded things about the world, are they the ones who actually reap and control most of the benefit? And I think it's easy to believe that actually the gains will not be distributed broadly. And if you look at something like one of the big issues we've had around globalization is that the economic theory, I think, has been proven out, which is that lower barriers to trade actually increase GDP globally. They're good on a macro scale. But what we've seen very acutely in the U.S. and how that's played out in U.S. politics is that those GDP gains were pocketed by certain groups and certain corporate interests, and the result is that we have a wave of populist politics that's fueled by genuinely being left out of a lot of the progress there. And so I think there's a similar risk with generative AI. We've done some research that shows in a particularly troubling fashion that women and workers of color are actually already starting to be left behind in their companies in terms of their being included in access to the technology and some of the uses of it. And the broader question, do jobs go away and are people structurally unemployed, I think is one that we don't actually really know. Over the longer term, it seems like there could be as many or more jobs and professions morph and the economic activity actually aids in job creation. But the risk is that in the short term, there are people in functions like business administrative functions where their jobs are actually pretty easily impacted by, there's productivity gains already. Their jobs are pretty easily impacted by generative AI, and some of those jobs will definitely go away.
So in the same way that the industrial age and then automation sort of ushered in not necessarily an elimination of the workforce, but a change in how people do work and the types of jobs that are available, AI might create the same opportunity, but that implies skilling. It implies putting the technology actually into people's hands. I mean, there's still a billion people that don't have access to the internet on the planet, right?
Yeah.
So who do you think is responsible for that, and do you see policy conversations heading in the right direction when it comes to that?
Yeah, I think, it's a pretty existential question in a way, and it depends upon your view of your own politics. If you look at the Scandinavian countries who are already always held up around this issue, they have social safety nets that actually have pretty robust retraining and reskilling support, and in exchange, companies pay more taxes to actually fund those programs. If you look at the US, we don't actually have those programs, government programs, to anywhere near the same degree. And so the responsibility falls on companies to train their employees. The interesting thing is that because the labor markets are so tight, we're actually seeing companies invest more in their employees than they have maybe traditionally. And so there is real investment in training and reskilling, keeping workers, rather than just laying off workers. There are exceptions, and we're seeing tech and finance go through some of those layoffs right now. But otherwise, I'm hearing at least about more specific, significant investments in training to transition workforces to what will be needed.
Last question. So I read recently on Charter a piece about how to, as an employer, speak to your team or your company about really difficult issues like the Middle East conflict.
Yeah.
Right now, you have both private sector and government leaders gathered here in Davos. Do you think they're having the right conversations in the right way about all the conflict happening in the world right now?
Well, and the truth about what happens here is that so much of the activity is actually more or less one-on-one meetings between business leaders, between politicians, and their entourages around them. But they're actually pretty individual meetings. And the research that we've been covering out of MIT around constructive communications shows that actually one-on-one conversations or small group conversations tend to be the ways, and this may seem kind of obvious, but that's the way you actually make more progress on contentious issues than a large town hall forum in a company, or maybe a sort of large venue here where you're talking about these issues. The thing that is significant here is that you do find people from different sides of issues actually coming together and meeting in ways that that doesn't actually happen organically otherwise. And so I would say, it's hard to generalize, but the smaller exchanges and the conversations between people on different sides of issues supports the idea that there are some things that potentially could come out of this.
as one UN official told me, diplomacy is a contact sport. So that's one of the reasons why events like this, I guess, are necessary. But Kevin Delaney, thank you
Great.
so much.
Tony, thank you.